Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our class today, wherever you may be and whenever this may be that you're watching it. Thank you for your interest. We are continuing our study of the gospel and its progress under the direction of the Holy Spirit and as chronicled by Dr. Luke. The 19th chapter of the book of Acts is Paul's ministry in Ephesus. And Luke adds so much detail to it that it's impossible to cover it in 1 week. So we covered half of it last week. And there's one particular incident that he focuses on that we'll look at today. Acts 19, verse 21. Now, after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. And then Demetrius the silversmith, beginning at verse 23. About that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of ARTEMIS, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is a danger that not only this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. And there resulted from that a tumult in the great theater. Verse 28. When they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So the city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, who were Paul's companions in travel. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And then the chancellor comes on the scene, beginning at verse 35. And when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. For we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no course that we can give to justify this commotion. And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. Now, all of this confusion, this rioting, this clamor, concerns the temple of Artemis, which was in Ephesus and was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This great temple was built by Croesus, king of Lydia, about 550 BC, and was rebuilt after being burned by a madman named Herostratus in 356 BC. The Artemisium was famous not only for its great size, over 350 by 180 feet, but also for the magnificent works of art that adorned it. The temple was destroyed by invading Goths in AD 262 and was never rebuilt. Little remains of the temple today. And here's what it looked like from an artist's conception: the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Artemis was the goddess of, in this case, of fertility. She is often portrayed in her statues with having many, many breasts, just covering the entire front part of her body. And she was the one who was here worshipped in this great temple. Now, what does it look like today? Like this. Almost nothing remains of it, just a few scattered stones and this column, and I strongly suspect that someone put these drums back into place just to show the place where it was. Now let's return to the text and look at it with just a little more depth and analysis. After these events, well, what events? You remember the events of Paul having reasoned in the synagogue for 3 months and then being expelled by some of the Jews who were stubborn and refused to believe. And remember that he then went to the lecture hall of Tyrannus and spent 2 years successfully there teaching the gospel. So after these events, Paul's still in Ephesus, but Paul made a decision, resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem. He's guided by the Spirit, and the Spirit is prompting him. And so this resolution comes from the guidance of the Spirit. And he's going to go through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem. And after that, he said, after I've been there, I'm going to go to Rome. He wanted to go to Rome. He had never been to Rome. He did not establish the church in Rome. It was established by someone else. It is often thought that Peter established the church in Rome, but there is no evidence that Peter was ever in Rome. But Paul does not intend to go there to build on another's foundation, as he said, but he goes there to see how the church is doing and what he can do to help. Now, he does go to Rome, but he doesn't go under the circumstances that he envisioned, because he will go as a prisoner, as we shall see later. I'll make one comment, too, about passing through Macedonia and Achaia. This is what he did. But he had originally told the people in Corinth that he would come there first, go to Macedonia and collect the great contribution, the great collection for the needy saints in Jerusalem, then go to Corinth and obviously take their collection and go to Jerusalem. However, he changed his plans and went to Macedonia directly. And that's the plan that he sets forth here. He had written 1 Corinthians earlier than this. And so he goes to Jerusalem. He plans to go to Jerusalem, obviously, to report on his third missionary journey, as well as to present the great collection. Verse 22, and having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers ahead of him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. The fact he stayed in Asia does not mean he stayed only in Ephesus. He used Ephesus as a base of operations, and out of Ephesus, obviously, he preached throughout the area, just as Apollos went to Corinth and preached from Corinth into the areas of Achaia. Now, we know about Timothy. We encountered him beginning back at Lystra in Paul's second missionary journey. This is the first time that we meet Erastus. He's mentioned 2 more times in the New Testament. Paul mentions him in 2 Timothy 4:20 and in Romans 16:23, in which he adds the interesting detail that Erastus was the city treasurer, that is, of Corinth. And in 1929, an inscription mentioning an Erastus was found near a paved area northeast of the theater of Corinth. It has been dated to the mid-1st century and reads, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, paved it at his own expense. Now, is the Erastus mentioned in Romans 16:23 the same as the Erastus mentioned here, whom Paul sends into Macedonia? I think that he is. You see down below a picture of this paved area, and it says, as you read, Erastus in return for his aedileship. An aedile was a person who was in charge of public activities in a city, and often was the beginning of one's course in political service, the first step, and then moving up to being a quaestor and so forth. And he paved it at his own expense. That is characteristic in Rome. Wealthy people often, in a philanthropic measure, took care of things with their own expense, their own money. And that, of course, helped keep the taxes down in Rome. We'll see some more of that in just a moment. So the introduction. Now, Demetrius the silversmith. Verse 23, about that time. And again, about that time, Luke is saying, I'm not defining exactly how much time has elapsed, but in that area, in that time frame, we see this disturbance. He puts it as no little disturbance. We would certainly understand that as a big disturbance concerning the way. And Luke mentions the way many times. He uses that to describe, we would say, Christianity, to describe the church. He included in that, of course, would be the doctrine of Christ, the gospel of Christ, but also included in that term would imply the way that Christians live, the lifestyle. So it's a good term, the way. And this big disturbance arose. Why? A man named Demetrius, a silversmith, made silver shrines of Artemis. Now you see the word for silver there, agorokoptos, and that means he is a real talented person. He is if you look on down by craftsman, technitais, that's the word we get technical from. So he's well trained. He has a talent for making items of silver. Silver shrines, the word in Greek is naos, which means temple. So conclusion, very likely these silver shrines were miniatures of the temple itself, carefully crafted, beautifully made. The temple you saw is a very beautiful structure from what can be conceived of it. And so he's making these souvenirs, if you please, or votive offerings. And some have suggested that they were actually boxes, and you take the top off, and there was a miniature statue of Artemis inside, and that they would be used as votive offerings in the temple itself, would be placed there, or perhaps they would be in a person's home as a place where they could remember and perhaps even worship Artemis. So that's the plan. That's this business that he operated. And Luke adds he brought no little business, meaning he brought much business to the craftsmen. So Demetrius had a number of people working with him who were technitais, who were technicians making these silver shrines. Now he gathered these people together. Likely he gathered them together in the agora. It makes sense to do that. That's the public square. That's where people met for public events. So he gathered them together, but also he gathered together the workmen, ergatos. Ergon, the word means to work. It can mean to make something with your hands. So these were workmen in similar trades. Now, commentators have said similar trades meant that they were essentially making about the same thing, some type of souvenir that people would buy of the temple, because people came from all over to Ephesus to see this temple, and so they would buy the souvenirs, very much as Roman Catholics go to Rome and will buy all kinds of religious trinkets that are sold there. So these workmen, ergatos, were working from terracotta. So these were clay souvenirs, maybe of the temple itself, maybe of Artemis, but at any rate, they would have been less expensive, but they still would have been in that category of items to be sold. So he gathers those as well, and he says to them all, as they are meeting in the agora, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. Now just focus on that, because that's the problem. This is exactly the concern that Demetrius has. We are losing business. Our profits are decreasing. We are very much in danger of going out of business. We lose our source of income. I think that concern overrides everything else that Demetrius is about to say. And let's see that. In verse 26, he said, "And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia," the Asia province was, as you know, very, very large, "this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods." Now, here's something interesting. Demetrius got it right. He understood exactly what Paul was teaching. Paul was teaching that these idols, these figures, gods made with hands, are not gods. He knew what Paul said, but he didn't believe that, or he was denying that, because in denying that, he is able to propagate his trade. If he accepted it, okay, they're not gods, then of course that's going to do damage to his business and his profit margin. So in verse 27, Demetrius continues, "And there is danger, not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship." I think that's a slight exaggeration that she was worshipped in the entire world. But the point that Demetrius is making is that Artemis is honored and worshipped very broadly, not just in Ephesus, throughout the province of Asia and beyond. So here are the points that Demetrius makes. The first one we already saw: we're going to lose our profit. Secondly, Paul is teaching that our gods are not gods at all. Thirdly, the temple will be counted as nothing. Today it is nothing. And fourth, Artemis will be deposed from her magnificence. This is the marketplace in Ephesus. This is no doubt the place where Demetrius gathered together his technicians and his craftsmen. It is, of course, in ruins today, but that's the central meeting place of people. And as well, business took place there in Ephesus. Now, the tumult in the great theater, verse 28. When they heard this, that is, these technicians and these craftsmen, and I don't know how many there were a large number of them, I'm sure. When they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Now, this expression, "great is Artemis of the Ephesians," was one that was well known. It was the one that was used oftentimes when people would worship and write about and describe this temple. "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." We have some of the writers of that day using that very phrase. And so, of course, they cried this out. And the city, Luke says, was filled with confusion. And they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. Get the picture. In the forum, or in the agora, rather, in the agora, Demetrius is gathering these people, and there's something going on. People could tell that he was angry. They were listening to him, and so people begin to gather. When something is going on of this nature, something out of the ordinary, and something where there's anger and passion involved, people oftentimes come to just see what's going on. So I think the city filled with confusion means the word gets around. There's something going on in the agora. Demetrius and a whole bunch of these craftsmen and technicians are there, and they are really complaining. They're very upset. Let's go see what's going on. And so you have this great crowd of people, and they go to the theater. I think that's just an impulsive decision, not planned at all. But it's a mob action, you see, and there's not much rationality with mobs. So the mob grabs two of Paul's companions. Paul is not immediately available, so they get Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's companions in travel, and they drag them into the great theater in Ephesus. Now, before we go on, there are different Gaiuses mentioned in the New Testament. It's a very common name, Roman name, and probably is not to be identified with three other Gaiuses that we find in the New Testament. This is a Gaius from Macedonia. We have a Gaius also from Derbe, for instance. So our Aristarchus, on the other hand, I think this is the Aristarchus that is mentioned a couple of other times in Scripture. So he was a faithful traveling companion of Paul. They dragged him into the theater, his companions in travel, verse 30, and Paul wished to go in among them, among the crowd, and the disciples wouldn't let him. You can just imagine Paul. Let me go out there. I can reason with them. I can get this my point across. I can help them understand. And the disciples said, no, you don't go out there, Paul. The level of furor and anger and emotion out there in that theater is too dangerous for you. They'll tear you apart. Don't do it. And he continues to want to go. And look at verse 31. Even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Interesting. You know, Luke gives us insights into the city of Ephesus and more detail about it so we can understand how Ephesus was structured. But also he gives us interesting insights into the life of Paul. And here's one of them. How did Paul become friends with these Asiarchs? We don't know. That's just going to remain a mystery. Who are Asiarchs? Well, I mentioned a minute ago about aediles who do things for the city at their own expense, such as Erastus. Asiarchs, I'm rather sure, would be identified with what is otherwise known as the curiales. These were people who were businessmen in towns all over the empire. And they would, of their own, give money to the city. They would provide for instance, the public games. They would provide for the public welfare system. They would provide for the water supply, the sewers. They would, in other words, pay the expenses of the city. Now, they did this on a rotating basis so that they only served for 1 year. And as I said before, this is the secret to Rome's great success and the secret to the fact that they kept their taxes so very low. When you have these businessmen in a philanthropic way taking care of the expenses of the city. Now, in the province of Asia, these curiales were called Asiarchs, that is, leaders of Asia. There were 10 of them, and they were appointed by the proconsul, and they served 1 year. There was only one Asiarch appointed for Ephesus, but obviously Paul knew more than one. And they had found out what was going on and sent a message to him and urged him not to go into the theater. In verse 32, now some cried out one thing and some another. It'd be interesting to know just exactly what they were crying out, but it was total confusion. The assembly was in confusion. And most of them did not even know why they had come together. They were just dragged in there because something's going on, and people are always curious and want to know what's going on and will get involved with some type of crowd or mob action just because they want to get in on that action. So the crowd doesn't know what's going on. And some in the crowd, this interesting mob action, some in the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward. Alexander was obviously a Jew, and the Jews had thrust him forward, like, Alexander, go up there and talk and calm these people down. Now, what is he going to say? If you read on in this verse, Alexander motioned with his hand, wanting to make a defense to the crowd. He's standing up there moving his arm up and down, trying to quiet them, get their attention. Now, we're not told exactly what Alexander was going to say, but it is very likely that he was going to say, don't blame us, Jews. The Jews were oftentimes blamed and suffered persecution, and they had achieved a tenuous relationship with the Roman government that they could continue to live and pursue their occupations and even to worship in their synagogues as long as they caused no problems. Now, we saw that in Rome, they caused problems, and Claudius the emperor had driven them out of Rome. And so I think that's probably why you see the reaction here in verse 34. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," using that same chant, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." I think that's probably what it was, because it is entirely possible that Alexander here is the same Alexander Paul mentions later as Alexander the coppersmith, who did me much harm. If that is the case, Alexander, a Jew, was converted and then apostatized and turned against Paul. If that is the case, these coppersmiths often worked with the artisans, worked with the technicians, would have worked then with Demetrius. And a coppersmith would have made, therefore, a souvenir of copper, which is of less value than silver, and then plated it with silver. That is possibly the situation. And Alexander, involved in this very trade that is in danger of being undermined by Paul's teaching. So the Jews push him forward to say, look, I am involved with Demetrius. I make these shrines, and it's not a problem. Don't blame us for what Paul is teaching. That is a great possibility, I think, of what's going on. But here's the theater. To give you a view of what it actually looked like. This is the great theater of Ephesus. It's one of the few structures that remains intact from biblical days. It's exactly as it was, with some damage, but very, very little damage from the days of Paul, the great theater of Ephesus. While we've got it there, I'll tell you something that happened to me in that theater. When we made a trip to Turkey many years ago now, we visited several of the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation, the 7 churches of Asia. And when we were there, I would read from the book of Revelation the particular letter that Christ addressed to that particular church. And I'd been doing that. We came to Ephesus, so I stood up on one of those seats and took my pocket Bible, and Alice was filming me, and I read the account. And similar to Paul, I suffered some being drowned out, so to speak. There were some kids, young people, I think they were Germans, and they saw me reading and they decided they were going to interrupt me. So they started singing songs, and they kept increasing in volume until they drowned me out and I had to quit. So things go on, the same things go on. This is the same theater. Now, the chancellor, often called the town clerk here. Some of the theologians are going to give the word chancellor, the term chancellor, because it perhaps better describes this person. He is, in a way, the CEO, like a mayor of the city of Ephesus. He's in charge of things generally, has a very high position, reports to the proconsul, of course, is the ultimate authority. And the chancellor probably had waited to try to figure out what was happening before he took over. Now, when he stood up and people recognized who he was, they would immediately quiet down. So Luke tells us when the town clerk, the chancellor, had quieted the crowd, he said, and we'll look at what he said, because it is very well crafted. It is an excellent speech that got the job done. First of all, he says, men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? This is the technique we have seen that is used by those who proclaim the gospel, Paul, Peter, and others. We've talked about it before. If you want to address a crowd of people who do not agree with you, and you want to bring them to your point of view, you need to start with common ground. You need to start with what they know and believe, that you know and believe. And so the chancellor says, who in the world does not know that the city of Ephesus is the temple keeper of the great Artemis? And like, don't you understand? We all believe that. We know that. So why the clamor? Why the turmoil? Who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper? Interesting word. The word for temple keeper is now koros. The first part of that word now is temple, and the last part is sweeper. So literally that means the temple sweeper, like custodian, like someone who takes care of, cleans up, temple keeper in that sense, of the great Artemis. In other words, Ephesus has been given the great privilege and responsibility of taking care of this marvelous, beautiful temple that's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And not only that, of the sacred stone that fell from the sky. Now, what's that? Very likely a meteorite that came down to earth and maybe was embedded in the earth. And at some point, as in Ephesus' early history, somebody dug it up and interpreted it as a sign from heaven, from the gods, and therefore as the place that a temple should be built to Artemis. And he proceeds, verse 36. Seeing that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. In other words, calm down, because we all know that Ephesus is the temple sweeper for the temple of Artemis. So calm down. It can't be denied. So don't do anything rash, anything you're going to regret. Verse 37. And now the chancellor begins to say why they might regret their actions. For you have brought these men here, namely Gaius and Aristarchus, who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. These men are innocent. They haven't done anything. They haven't blasphemed the goddess. They haven't acted in a sacrilegious way to defile the temple. You need to stop and think. And then he moves to another point. When he now points out, we all know that Ephesus is the temple sweeper. And secondly, that you have brought innocent men in here. Now, thirdly, he opens up the possibilities for Demetrius. What needs to be done if Demetrius and his craftsmen have a problem? And what he does is give 3 options for Demetrius and his craftsmen. First, he said, if they have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open. Demetrius, take them to the courts. Pursue the legal way, not a way of mob violence. Take them to the courts. Agoraioi. And that word you can recognize is the word for agora. It literally means agora hamera. It means that a day in the agora, a day court in the agora. And every day, evidently, there was a court of, I guess we'd say, common pleas, where people could come and could bring complaints before the justices. Now, if that didn't satisfy Demetrius, if he didn't get a verdict that satisfied him, he could go to the proconsul. Now that's going all the way to the top. Remember that proconsuls have immense authority. They're the ultimate Roman authority. And there was only one proconsul in Ephesus over the province of Asia. So why it's used in the plural is a little confusing. And maybe Luke is just saying proconsuls are there when you need them. Others have suggested it's in the plural because proconsuls often delegated their responsibilities to legati, who would hear the cases in the court. So go to the proconsul and let them bring charges against one another, either in the day court, in the agora, or the proconsul. Bring him in. Now, verse 39, if you seek anything further, if you still are not satisfied, if Demetrius is still not satisfied by these decisions from the court or from the proconsul, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. Now here's where we get another view of what's going on in Ephesus. The word assembly is the word ecclesia. It's the same word from which we translate church, which of course means called out An ecclesia points to the fact that ultimately and originally, Ephesus was a Greek city long before the Romans were there. And in Greek cities, every city had an ecclesia, or the provision for the ecclesia. They often had little auditoriums or amphitheaters, I would say, that where the ecclesia met. They were the ecclesterion. And so these were places where the people came together. Everyone who had voting rights, every voting citizen would be a member of the ecclesia. And it would be, of course, in this case, since the Romans were now in control, it would be the proconsul who would call that ecclesia, perhaps the chancellor and the proconsul working together. But there had to be a calling together of this assembly. That's why ecclesia does mean call out. And they would call out for a special meeting. And what meeting? What the chancellor is saying is, if Demetrius and his associates are not satisfied with the decision of the court or the decision of the proconsuls, then it becomes a constitutional matter. It becomes a matter of the town charter. It is a matter of the law. The law has to be changed. The charter has to be changed. The Constitution has to be changed, because operating the way we are now, the courts and the proconsul would decide things. They would decide if something was constitutional. You want to change it? That's not like making an amendment to our Constitution. Then we have to go that route. We have to call the ecclesia together. Now, 3 possibilities for Demetrius. Surely one of them would satisfy him. I think that's what the chancellor had in mind. And then he comes in the last part of his talk to the people in the theater. He says, we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there's no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. I think you can see in the chancellor's words that he's scared himself. He says, we, not you, we really are in danger. Because if this gets back to the emperor and there's a riot and commotion that cannot be calmed and settled legally, Ephesus could lose its charter. It could lose its standing as a free city in the Roman Empire. And even the Roman army could come in and wreak havoc and punishment upon the city. We are really in danger. The Romans generally, out in the provinces, allowed the people, the provincials, to live as they saw fit, religiously, go about practices, politically. They could keep their Greek city charters, government, and their businesses and trade. They just kept a hands-off attitude, except when there was turmoil, when there was confusion, which the Jews had caused much confusion in the past. And now, of course, many in the crowd were thinking that the Jews are responsible for this. And so whatever, we are in danger of being charged with rioting. There's no cause. We have no cause for this commotion. There's no legal reason for it. It's rather like Gallio when he dismissed the charges against Paul. There's no reason here. I don't have a cause to proceed with this case. So the chancellor dismissed it. And when he said these things, the assembly was gone, dispersed. And once again, in the good providence of God, Paul had been saved from a disastrous situation and could continue to preach the gospel. So thank you for joining us today for this episode in the theater in Ephesus. And we shall, Lord willing, continue next week and follow Paul as he goes to Troas. And certainly I wish for you now a joyous day. If this is Sunday, you're watching it, may you have a joyous worship and worship God in spirit and in truth, and receive the rich blessings of God our Father and Christ our Savior and the Holy Spirit.